everyone, and thank you for joining us on today's PropTalk episode. PropTalk is a property management podcast that is powered by Resman, which is an Inhabit company. I'm Elizabeth Francisco. I'm the CXO, which stands for Chief Experience Officer at Inhabit, and I'm your host for today's episode. And today we're talking about what are rental housing legislative priorities and goals for 2023. And before you think this is not an exciting topic, I would say hold on to your seats because there's an awful lot to talk about. We knew 2023 would be a transformational year for the industry. And as a true veteran, myself being in the industry for over 30 years, the only thing that's constant is change. And we continue to face changes and to have different challenges that we have to overcome in the space. So this is an important episode that you don't want to miss. I want to give a brief overview real quick about industry trade associations and some of the data they've been putting out. And I was interested to see the actual number. But if you go to one of our trade association websites, a couple to name, NMHC, NAA, IREM, you're going to see that right now that we're stating that there's 38.9 million Americans that we provide homes for in the apartment industry. And that includes every variety of renters, seniors, teachers, firefighters, healthcare workers, families with children, and many others across the nation. Something you may not realize, the multifamily housing also provides and supports 17.5 million jobs. And we generate, I say we as a supplier because we're part of that too, over $3.4 trillion of economic activity in the United States. So you can see that the industry plays a significant role in maintaining and providing our nation's rental housing. However, there are various policy and economic challenges that we have faced, and we continue to face, and they are mounting. Finance and capital market conditions, the proposed blueprint for the Renters' Bill of Rights, if you haven't heard about that, and HUD's reinstatement that just happened of what many consider to be a very flawed 2013 disparate impact rule, and more are threatening our ability to maintain or deliver new rental housing. And that's rental housing that's desperately needed to support a growing need. So today, I'm very thankful that we have an amazing guest that's going to be helping me kind of unpack some of those topics because there's a lot to talk about and there are industry priorities and goals that we need to be well versed on. So that's why I've invited Jay. Hello, Jay. Say hello
Hi,
to the
Elizabeth.
audience.
Thanks for having me here.
Well,
Great to be
thanks.
with you today.
Well, thank you. And we've known each other for a while, but we've never really got to have a really good conversation because it's kind of been, as often in the industry, you have the acquaintances and you pass, or we get to cross paths on Advocacy Day. First off, I just want to say it was a real pleasure talking to you and getting to know you a little bit to prep for this podcast. But I'm just really thankful there's people like you that are willing to donate your time to help educate our industry from the front lines to the executives to the owners. What you do and how you donate your time is really important. So to get us started, and we were starting to get into this, and I stopped Jay. So hopefully I didn't mess up your mojo. But I didn't know the answer, so I wanted to make sure we captured it. But how did you end up doing what you're doing? Because you are an important part of our industry and a good voice for us and a great advocate. So tell us about what you're doing today and how you came into this role.
Yeah, so my experience has been as an attorney and operations executive in this space. And so I will work with property management companies and vendors in the rental housing space to help make sure they're building and using products in the property management side predominantly that comply with the law, that are working effectively and efficiently. And so there's a lot of as an attorney and as a former lobbyist and regulatory counsel for NMHC and NAA, and earlier with the home builders, I've spent a good chunk of my career taking these regs, some of which, like we were talking about, are clearly about housing, rental housing.
Mm-hmm.
They might come from HUD or they might come from some state or locality. Or equally, something that is not clearly about rental housing, but might have to do with marketing or might have to do with payments or renter's insurance or something more broadly, and interpreting and turning it into, all right, if I'm operating a region or operating a portfolio, what do I do about that? How do I manage that? What do I change in terms of how I communicate with prospects and residents, how I run my internal processes, how I keep my documentation, and so forth.
Mm.
So, I got into it here in Washington, D.C., um, because this is, a space where we see these, this regulation. That's what we do in Washington, D.C., right? We're producing more regulation and legislation all the time. And if Congress can't agree to get something done, often we see a pretty active regulatory agency side at HUD, at the CFPB, at the Federal Trade Commission, and so forth. And that's what we're seeing now here under the Biden administration. So that's a little bit about how I got into it with NMHC and NAA. I've worked as general counsel with a couple of vendors in the space. And now, as a principal for my own firm, I advise companies in the space, vendors and property operators, about compliance with property management issues.
So before we jump into some of the meatier topics, I told you that we have some formality we have to do, but we also we'll be a little informal. I'm just curious from your perspective as a lobbyist, when you went into being a lobbyist, like, what surprised you? Was there like your perception going into doing something like that versus the reality?
Yeah, I think one of the things that surprised me, I'd worked in other businesses. I'd worked in the financial services, banking business before. So I think what surprised me in going into the rental housing space, which was back in the 90s, was the fact that if you would explain to folks on Capitol Hill, their idea of rental housing was what was done under the HUD programs.
Mm-hmm.
And that was really just a fraction of what owners who, many of whom were operating without a lot of subsidy support, had to deal with. There were broad housing rules, the Fair Housing Act, for example,
Right.
Or non-housing rules like privacy and marketing rules and things like this that would apply to property operators. But there wasn't a good understanding of rental housing as a unique constituency other than Section 8,
Right.
or the HUD program, or low-income housing tax credit over at the IRS and some of the state agencies. So there was a lot of open space to go in and explain why these topics, were important and how they impacted us, in talking to an advocate, talking to a policymaker as an advocate, and then also taking it back to help operators figure out what to do about it. We had, as one example, some design and construction issues around accessible design going back, 30 years ago now. And there was not good understanding of these informal guidelines that HUD had put out in the industry, and not good understanding from HUD about how they could promulgate them in such a way that at the right time in the construction process or the rehab process, these rules would actually, people would actually pay attention to them, and that there was the professional capacity among an architect or among somebody in the code process to review for this before signing off on a project and going forward with construction. So, I think the understanding now, it's decades later, the understanding is a lot better, but it's still the case that, when these issues come up, we're one of many constituencies on things like the use of consumer data or the telecommunications issues or some other day-to-day property management issues.
If you wouldn't mind talking a little bit about, just giving us some context about what this is, because a lot, I can just tell you from my own experience out on the road since January, there's a lot of people in our industry who are not aware of this initiative by the administration. They don't know what it is. Sure, at Advocate, there'll be a lot of conversation about this next week. But could you give us some context about how did this come about and what is the goal?
Sure. So, the administration started with, the Biden administration started with, and heard, I think, the rental housing industry's call that we don't have enough rental housing being built in this country, that the household formation on a long-term basis is ahead of the new product that we produce, whether it's single-family or multifamily rental housing, and the existing product that we have, the older product, becomes obsolete. And so as a result, we need more housing, rental housing, and particularly more affordable rental housing. We have good programs, but we need additional federal and state support for things like housing tax credit and other production programs, middle income affordable housing, as well as traditional low income affordable housing. So there's, a category of topics around that, and the feds have some ability to fund that, but some of the issues really in the delays and the reasons why we don't have more of this kind of housing in the places we need it are state and local issues. So that's one set of issues. I think we're going to spend less time on that today, more focus on some of the property operations issues, which go to the Renter Bill of Rights that you're talking about.
Right.
That was something in January that you say the Biden administration said and has listened to a lot of folks on the tenant advocate side. I think the administration reads the numbers in terms of how many tenants there are versus how many individual operators there are. And so it's probably good politics to do some work around tenant friendly proposal or blueprint for a renter bill of rights. And I think it's in that environment that the administration isn't just saying to the federal agencies, here's something to do, but also is actively, finding issues and encouraging states to look at legislation and even enforcement activity in these areas too. An example of that would be the junk fees that we'll talk about. And that's one where the Biden administration is concerned about and sees good consumer protection in talking about junk fees and surprise fees that would show up as a hotel resort fee or, for renting a car, things like that, and for rental housing. So we're in kind of a broader rubric of all these other sub areas that have surprise junk fees. And they have not only encouraged the agencies to look at this. And so HUD Secretary Marcia Fudge put a letter out earlier this week with some encouragement for the rental housing industry around junk fees. But also, we see the administration encouraging states to pick up the ball and legislate in this area too.
Yeah. So there's quite a few things that are included in the initial blueprint, right? The drafts that they're working on. So if we dive into that, can you back up just for a second and talk about what are junk fees? What does that entail from from the perspective of the administration and the coalition working on this?
Yeah. So, I think what they're concerned about are fees that are not transparent and fees that are a surprise in that sense. It's not clearly explained. There's not clear notice to the resident or to the individual who wants to go to a hotel, but is surprised by a $75 resort fee that isn't in the original advertising. So one is kind of the sense of surprise. And the other is kind of a fairness analysis about, is this really a justified fee? Is this a fee for something, or is this just, a fee that is not the benefit, the reason for it isn't well articulated in any of the paperwork. It's just kind of tacked on. So, I think specifically as it relates to what HUD has said, they've taken that transparency and fairness. And in the March 7th letter from the HUD secretary, which was, I would say, an encouragement or guidance and best practices, it's non-mandatory, but it has some concepts that we see in some states' legislation and also in, encouraging rental housing operators to do this on a voluntary basis too.
And so from a voluntary basis, we're talking about things like at the time of applying for a unit, are you disclosing all the potential fees that go along with living at that community?
Yeah, we'll see, because a lot of them, there is a question about what's HUD's role here, because a lot of these are set already by state law, and so when we look at it, there are basically four specific items that Secretary Fudge focuses on in the letter. One is limiting rental application fees to just only those that actually cover actual and legitimate costs for services, right? And so this is getting at the idea that, if you are reviewing all of these applications for a unit, that you somehow are able to justify, as you said, what's the time and effort that's involved in this? You've got the cost of getting a consumer report and other things. And then you also have some staff time. To what degree can you justify that, for somebody who's getting paid X dollars an hour and is taking 15 minutes or 20 minutes or 45 minutes to review a particular application, how much time it's truly costing the operator in order to do that. And so that's one idea. Again, not mandatory, but
No.
showing that these application fees are actual and legitimate costs. Right.
And
Yeah,
that's
I think as a specific, we saw more indicators of applicant fraud, particularly during COVID.
Yep.
I think the use of fraud detection tools in the applicant process is more common than it was before, and so that's another layer to make sure you're checking on to make sure that the consumer who's applying
Yep.
really is the person who's background. I think we all understand that conceptually, but if that's taking longer, that plus
Yep.
other reviews of appeals of an application for
Yep.
additional information the applicant provides, it may be that if you last looked at this 6, 7, 8 years ago and you said, well, it's costing us about, I don't know, $40 a pop to do this, that you may want to take another look at it again where you've got a different staffing model, higher costs, and a
Yep.
more complex process. This may be more like I don't know what, a significantly higher number today to process one applicant
Yep.
than was the last time you looked at it.
And it's interesting.
And I think I was just going to say another thing that HUD again is asking or encouraging is the fact that if you've done one application, then can that be reused with the same operator, or the same owner if they have other properties in that market, and that is an optional. This idea of a reusable application is a concept that you see in California passed a law around a reusable screening report last year. It's optional for a housing provider there. Washington State has had it for several years. Maryland also has an optional choice where a housing provider could do this if they wanted to. So, this isn't the first time we've heard of this concept.
Right. It's like a portfolio centric or regional portfolio centric application process.
That's right.
Okay.
That's right. And I think then the question is, to what degree are these, is it really an efficiency, or is it something where you might have the same property manager, but the owners have very different ideas of their goals for the individual property, and it doesn't work, isn't feasible, even though the operator and the website may be, look alike or look similar, but the ownership interests are very different.
Yep. No, that's a great point. And I would say this is probably one of the hot topics that as I'm learning about the subjects we're talking about, this one's come up already. There's been quite a bit of conversation because I think, the concern around this, portfolio centric or regional application is not only do you have different owners at each asset, potentially, if not multiple owners on an asset, but for one applicant to apply and pay that administrative fee to process an application, they typically want to know that there's a unit available that they will meet those qualifications. And properties, a mile away from one another can have very different pricing structures.
Right.
Right. So
Right.
how do you siphon through that without driving up the cost of processing an application? Because I haven't heard anyone talk about that yet. About the flip side of that is there's got to be either better technology, which costs money, or you've got to have people involved that are helping do a better discovery of each applicant to help them determine which units they could actually qualify for. Because I think that's the reality. You don't want to be putting money out for an application that you legitimately have no chance of getting approved for that apartment. That's why we have qualifying criteria, and we try to do our best to, make sure that's front and public and professionally managed units.
Yeah, I mean, in our industry, we're not like airlines or something like that. The ownership interests of rental housing are, very diverse. It's, it's one of the most popular investments in the United States, and so in any particular market, even though, a bunch of 200 unit buildings are managed professionally, the property management and ownership interests may be very, very different. So once we dig in and explain, I think there's better understanding about this. And again, this is an area where states have passed laws to address this in relatively, small number of states, but some states have acted in that space, left the option to housing providers, and it's been a pretty low take rate, not zero, but a pretty low take rate among housing providers that have wanted to offer this portability.
Yeah. Well, and I could see too, as people are in the multifamily space, we're looking at ways to centralize their business. then I could see how there's a process where you could it could work, right? If you have the same, price ranged units in a specific area, bringing an applicant in or a potential prospect before they become an applicant and helping them kind of understand their options from a centralized view, there might be an opportunity where that might make more sense, but not everyone can do that.
Right.
That's very different. It's and you said, did you say there was four key things?
Yeah. So those first two were really
Okay.
about what fee you charge.
Hmm.
The other two are really about how you're disclosing them.
Hmm.
So there's and I think here this is one where the housing, it's in the housing provider's interest to make sure there's good understanding of these fees, because if they need to then subsequently collect on them,
Hmm.
where the tenant is able to say, nobody ever told me about this, I shouldn't have to pay it, there's no document that I ever saw that I am going to owe an additional fee for this service. It can be harder to recover on that if there's a dispute later. And I think the other thing is, in a bunch of states, you've got these fees are pretty well, in many cases are pretty well spelled out, that you can charge for this,
Hmm.
renter's insurance, and you can charge for
Right.
utility management, things like that. So I think here it's something about how it's presented, right? Is there
Hmm.
in one place? What HUD is saying is, identify the bottom line amounts, put that in the lease documents, with the kind of the recurring costs and what they stand for, and maybe even include them in the advertisements. I don't know. I think in advertising, there's a lot of information that's shared already around rent
Hmm.
and duration and the unit
Hmm.
parameters. So I don't know that we're going to start to see a new kind of pricing at the top end of the website that's got an all-in price, when residents have a
Yeah.
huge variety of preferences about what they want. But
Right.
I think they're wanting to say, is it in the lease documents and is in somewhere before the consumer signs, so they know what they're going to pay and what it goes for. And so that kind of fee disclosure, I think, is really what they're getting at with the last two items in the secretary's letter.
Okay. Oh, and again, I think it's interesting as this conversation's come back around, and I recall throughout the pandemic, and we were talking about the rent collections, and trying to help. We were asked, and we participated to give data so that we could help lobby for more stimulus to help renters stay in their homes. Um, but I was thinking about how many times we had to make the distinction between professionally managed units and what might be more of your true S&B, single family. Like there's a big difference because as I hear you talking about it, and then, this is anecdotally, but don't sit in on every customer that onboards with us, but for the most part, I know, we have that functionality and it's highly utilized where people are displaying that type of information through the application process. So they're being transparent with it. And so it makes me wonder, is that really the difference? Is a lot of what's being driven in this Renters Bill of Rights? Is there a perception that's inaccurate about professionally managed units and unprofessionally managed units and being lumped in together?
Yeah, I think it depends on the specifics,
Hmm.
and I think there are, clearly there are more fees that are being pushed on housing providers, professionally managed or
Hmm.
small operators, and there's a need to pass that through and articulate what that's about.
Yep.
And I think kind of one of the learnings from the COVID experience for advocates on both sides was that this administration and some of the tenant advocates were very open to the idea that you could put more disclosure and notice information about the alternatives to eviction,
Hmm.
and the whole process for applying for support, for the rental assistance funds and so forth during COVID. That housing providers were carrying a lot more information and disclosure that federal agencies and states wanted to
Hmm.
get out to consumers in need, at a time to give an alternative to eviction. And so I don't see that going away. I think we'll continue to see some awareness of that. But I think what's different now is, there's we don't have billions of dollars for consumers who are late on the rent. I'm on the
Hmm.
board of a affordable housing provider in the Washington D.C. area, and we definitely see that the support that was there in 22 and 21 in Northern Virginia and Washington D.C. as it was around the country isn't there anymore. And so, I think the counties and states are increasingly understanding that if somebody is, missing on paying the rent and has to find some alternatives, they don't have federal support for that. There's not a lot of state money at all for that. And so we have these notices about, finding alternatives to eviction, finding local agencies that might be able to help, a nonprofit sponsor or something like that. But it's a lot, it's a lot harder to do now. And yet at the same time, I think unfortunately we may be ending up at some sort of resolution even after this, because it just isn't that money to pay for a tenant who doesn't have a job. And so it may be, we may anticipate slightly longer eviction alternative processes with new approaches, but absent, some funding, probably, from the feds to continue that support. I think we may just be drawing out and extending the process with different outcomes than what we had during COVID when there was that federal support.
I know I'm not telling you anything you don't know, especially if you're involved with actual real estate. But there's so much talk about the rent gains, right? The perception of the rent gains. And there was double-digit rent gains from 20 to 21 to 22 if you average them. But if you average them out, correction. But if you average them out, I think it only came out to 6.6, like it was like within 6.5 to 7% rent increase when you averaged over a 3-year period, which is not the same thing as coming out to the market or to the public with, here we are year over year gaining 17, 20% rent growth, because that's not actually the reality. And I think the other side of it, and this is available on I believe NAA's website and NMHC's as well, but the cost of doing business. Not only did we deal with those supply chain issues, and this is what's the challenge about what you just said about extending out the eviction process, because there's somebody's holding the bag for that. And it's typically going to impact those owners, those investors. How attractive is this space to continue to invest in when you're trying to do that balance, right? You've got the eviction process that's playing out. You've got this year, like we're looking at rent gains. I think they're projecting 3.1% is year-over-year rent growth, but we're already seeing some signs of some negative rent growth. But that doesn't stop the property insurance or some of the other fees and mortgage fees and what's happening with the federal interest rate, how that's impacting the property. And so I think that was a lot to say, but I think what I've always wanted to ask, and I've just never been part of this conversation, is why do we struggle, you think, to have both sides of the conversation? Because it's very easy to sensationalize rent growth and the landlord raising rents. But we don't tend to see, other than the industry trying to advocate for it, anyone ever talking about the challenges of running multifamily today, the business needs, the operational needs, the mortgage, the interest rates increases, the insurance increases, things like that.
Yeah, I think housing providers do a good job of talking about it, but it's a constant job because there's enough turnover among policymakers that you always need to continue to educate the real estate page editor as well as policymakers about these costs and what's going up. Insurance costs, are driving, especially in some coastal markets, are having a significant impact at renewal for property operators, and that affects your bottom line. We have short memories, I think, in this country. We forget the billions and billions of dollars that the industry absorbed in unpaid rent that came, some of which was funded by the federal government backstop, but a lot of which was not. Yep. At a time when people were staying in property for a long time and having tens of thousands of dollars owed at move out because they'd been able to stay there for a long time, and eventually the bill came due, and in a lot of cases
we still have that problem. There's
housing
still
provider had to pay for it.
Yeah. There's still this delay that is still a long lasting. Because I hear about it when I'm out traveling about people that are still tied up in that eviction process, and unfortunately, like I said, the funds are no longer available. And then there's a whole nother issue about the challenges we had as an industry for renters to communicate with us so that we could actually help them help themselves. And I think that was probably one of the most frustrating parts of the rental assistance. But kind of staying in line with what we were just talking about, one of the sections of the draft of the Renters' Bill of Rights, it was talking about the stakeholder engagement. And it says that the White House, Department of Agriculture, Department of Treasury, and HUD, they're planning to meet with a broad and diverse and varying group of tenants and tenant advocates on a quarterly basis to hear their perspectives on dynamics in the rental markets and opportunities to strengthen tenant protections. And it goes on to say the meetings will enable agencies and their staff to learn more from lived experience and the expertise of tenants and their advocates to help them inform policy making and enforcement efforts. So what struck me about this conversation is, to someone who's kind of a novice and green at this, it it surprised me that the stakeholders did not necessarily include multifamily operators, owners, um, in the quarterly conversations. And maybe that's going to change. But what are your thoughts on that?
First of all, I think that the national rental housing trade groups have done a good job of engaging with the White House and with the
Okay.
individual agencies on these issues.
Hmm.
I think there's no question that this administration will continue to reach out actively to housing providers, but definitely
Hmm.
to residents to try to address their concerns, whatever that is. And so, I think it's an operating reality that we have to be able to articulate our case about
Hmm.
what running a business is like and how you want to have more affordable housing. You need more production. That in a lot of cases, these issues that are concerns, as you peel the onion away, you find that there are I don't know, we talked about disclosures, clear disclosures of fees that people, operators are following state
Hmm.
laws, or local ordinances about what those fees may be. And so, I think the education process needs to go on, but I think the national trades have done a good job of engaging on these issues. But I also know it's not going to go away as long as there are a lot more residents out there in the United States than
Hmm.
there are individual owners and operators, right?
Hmm.
The numbers are sort of in favor of what's the tenant's concern. So
Yeah.
I think that'll continue to be an issue with this administration. We'll continue to hear from it because it's a consumer protection that they want to address and extend.
And I think it's
So
one we
it's a bit of a
share.
trade-off.
Yeah, and I think too, in fairness, I think we share that, and I say that as we, being in the operator's mindset and an investor in multifamily myself. I think I think during the pandemic we demonstrated it as a whole, and that's where I always come back to is it really the smaller landlords that kind of fall in that term versus professionally managed units, where people generally do want to provide good. They want to be part of this solution, not part of a problem. But we just need to make sure the realities of what it takes and what we're facing on our P&Ls is not lost in that conversation.
Yeah, I think that's right. So, specifically on that, we're talking about this with Advocate coming
Hmm.
up this week. National
Hmm.
Apartment Association with National Multifamily Housing Council released several priorities for this year.
Okay.
Federal issues to work on. The four that NAA is focused on, with Advocate coming up in their congressional visits, regulatory visits coming up this week, are about improving the voucher program so that it works better. And housing providers know how to serve all markets.
Hmm.
You would get more voluntary participation in the voucher program if it were run more like professional property management,
Hmm.
and the popular way of running a market rate property that meets state and local requirements.
Hmm.
But
So,
that's
and you're an
an area
affordable,
which that
right?
program could be run better.
Yes, I was going to
Correct.
say because you're
Correct.
you have you're on a board for
But
an affordable housing community or portfolio. Um, it,
a portfolio, a nonprofit, yeah, here in
okay.
the DC area.
Hmm.
But I think this has been, something the industry has talked about for a while, that operators, for profit or nonprofit, choose whether they're going to participate in the voucher program. And as it has become less attractive to participate, housing providers have said, this is more expensive. This is, I understand the broader community need, but the regulatory requirements around it are not like what goes on in most of the market. They're sort of
Hmm.
idiosyncratic for running a voucher program, and the paperwork and so forth. So if that program could be run more like the market, you get more voluntary participation. And I
Mhm.
think there may be some examples of where uh, local housing authorities have made some program improvements, but there's clearly been a response that has said a housing provider must participate in the voucher program
Mhm.
and must take these idiosyncratic additional requirements, and that doesn't yield a good experience and a good participation when there could be a little more flexibility in how the voucher program is run and the requirements around it on the property management side. If we're looking to attract more voluntary participation in the program.
Yep. You are exactly right because being in those shoes, when you have the voucher program and you can rely on that rental payment or that, you're going to be made whole, that is very attractive to an owner and investor. But you're right, the administrative tasks. Also, if I'm not mistaken, some of the challenges with that program come back to how the policies can change and then they can also be made retroactive. So whereas you may have thought rent was made whole, now you're in the position of going back and working with the resident because there's potentially a shortage, as though they make things retroactive. So
Right.
um,
Right.
again, that you're right. You're just it's always been amazing to me, and like I said, I wish I had been more involved in the younger parts of my career, and we didn't start off talking about that, but as I was coming up through the ranks of multifamily, from the front lines to leadership, I wasn't as engaged with advocacy, and I didn't realize all the work and everything that everyone was doing on all of our behalfs. If you're in rental housing, but the more I've learned, it also seems like unfortunately, we do tend to stay on a lot of the same topics, right? We're still trying to move some things forward, and I guess that's just part of this process, right? It's a slow moving machine, but you've just got to continue to be present. And from what you're saying, be present and make our voices heard and get involved, so that every inch gained is in fact an inch gained.
I think that's right. It's a marathon, not a sprint, in terms of removing the barriers to more production of housing.
Mhm.
And it's important not to be distracted by a lot of additional requirements that don't create new housing,
Mhm.
and in some sense um, don't create units, don't even qualify more people. They sort of, change around the order in which people would qualify as a new set of requirements come out, or
Mhm.
they, change around how pricing is disclosed, but they don't, at the end of the day, you got to pay for a cost that the locality imposes on you in
Mhm.
a tax or license fee or inspection fee or whatever it is.
Yep. We got to make sure what looks good on paper actually gets to the end result we're all trying to get to.
Yeah.
Yeah, which I think we're all here because and we have advocate because we still have some work to do there. So you said, okay, there was a couple of priorities that we need to be aware of for NAA as we're coming up on advocate. Um, so we talked about the Section 8 housing voucher.
We were talking about. So in
Okay.
a couple years ago, and NAA and NMHC have played a key role on this, but the
Hmm.
CARES Act with some of the COVID area support,
Hmm.
consumer support, had a requirement that housing provider give 30 days notice to vacate. So a longer term
Hmm.
before they could move forward with the eviction process or eviction alternative process for a wide range of properties. Those that were federally backed by Fannie or Freddie or federally assisted under a
Hmm.
HUD or similar program. And so this is kind of carried over, right? We've said we're done with COVID, and in some ways we are as a nationwide emergency. But this legacy 30-day waiting period before you can move ahead with a notice to vacate lingers on and has
Hmm.
not been removed. So this is the kind of thing I was talking about when I said,
Yeah.
the money has gone away now, but some of these disclosure and waiting period requirements on property operations linger on. So
Mm.
that's something that NAA has identified with one of its priorities.
Okay.
Uh, and then the other two are really, incentivizing local governments to lower barriers to development so that we can have more supply. We talked about that. And then opposing federal efforts to um, add interfere with the landlord-tenant relationship and use carrots, not sticks, to increase affordable housing, rental affordability, and housing choice.
Yeah.
So, it's two similar themes, both for development as well as for operations. Let's find ways that incent participation rather than making participation in a clunky, idiosyncratic program an anti-discrimination matter. Let's make it something that housing providers would want to participate in, and frankly, have learned from, and the housing authorities learn from professional property management.
I was thinking about the number of new entrants into our space over the last, I like to say since 2013, right? Coming out of the Great Recession. We've had a lot of new property owners and new management companies. And to be honest, we're coming out of a down cycle. When you come into the beginning of an up cycle, you don't really, may not understand the significance of whether it's legislation or what happens in a down market. And so I was thinking about, what advice would you give to people who are maybe new into the industry about getting involved and being an advocate for multifamily, for their assets, for their management company, for their livelihood?
At the federal level, to stay engaged, again, being able to tell real life examples of challenges that have been created by, as you said, taxes or licensing fees, or other cost items, or delays in the permitting process, in the development process, or even just broadly, what's the experience? I can tell you that several times we've gone in and talked to agencies, and they've said, we haven't heard this for the first time. This is useful to know, because we don't get a lot of perspective from the housing providers, all the time. We hear a lot from the tenants, because there are a lot of them and a lot of groups, and they're always, often can be asking for things, but we don't always hear operationally what the big challenges are. So I think being able to communicate the message, work with the professional staffs that are on the federal, state, and local apartment association
Well, I
trade
think that's
groups,
key right there.
is a great way to be involved, because they're wonderful resources. And frankly, sometimes you got to make sure you're shooting at the right target. And I think the professional staffs really do a good job of saying, here's the person who is open to listening about the story that you have to tell for that market that you come from. And it's not always the person you think it is.
Yep.
And sometimes that person can be a real catalyst for getting something done.
Yep. Well, and the relationships that you have today at the local level could also be more significant in years to come if they progress and get into state and national level roles. So that's very true. I think I remember early on going to city council meetings. And, for those who are listening in on our audience, even if you're it doesn't matter what position you're on front lines, I think sometimes we forget we do have a vote as individuals. And so understanding what is impacting the multifamily industry, how does that align with our own personal goals and initiatives, and, how we believe economically and politically, you got to get out there and do your part too. And I think being involved at the local levels, getting involved with the local affiliates is super important, because, again, sometimes I've been surprised, and I guess I shouldn't be surprised because I was one of them. I didn't fully understand the implications of what was going on legislatively. It always, coming up, it always felt like it was, our owner's responsibility, our senior executive team's responsibility. But I think what I've come to understand since then is, we as voters, we also have a voice in those decisions, and you've got to make sure that you're just at least educated so you can make an informed decision for yourself. And I think you're right. The local affiliates are great for that, participating in the local city councils, sharing your stories. I'm very thankful that you pointed that out, because I don't, you never know who you're sitting next to. You go to the city council meeting, you stop, you talk, you share your story, your perspective. And so many people do not understand what it really means to be in property management, the day-to-day challenges the team faces, the challenges with, the just resident engagement. Like, how are we providing the best services for them? How do we still provide affordable housing, but not lose the quality housing? And the best people to say that are the people who are there day to day. Well, first, I just want to say, thank you for sharing your perspective and taking your time out. I know you're very busy and it's really appreciated. I feel more knowledgeable. I'm going to be there next week. So hopefully I will represent us well if I get any opportunity. But thanks again for joining us. We really appreciate it. Keep doing what you're doing. And, thanks. Hope you enjoyed your podcast with us or being on our podcast today.
Hey, thanks for having me today. And I think you'll enjoy the cherry blossoms. They look great when you're here in town, assuming they don't blow away in the next couple of days.
Okay,
But I look forward to
hold
seeing you
on
here
till
in
Tuesday.
at Advocate. That's it. That's it. Thanks for having me today.
Well, we'll see you at Advocate.
Thanks so much.
Be sure to subscribe to PropTalk on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And to learn more about Resman's property management platform and get more information on the multifamily ecosystem, check out myresman.com.